row over Islamophobia in the Conservative Party has been reignited after former Deputy Party Chair Lee Anderson was suspended. Anderson had made rather crude remarks about London Mayor Sadiq Khan. But with so much heat in this conversation, do we really know what we mean when we talk about Islamophobia? Joining me to discuss is Rakib Ehsan, author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. Rakib Ehsan, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Rakib, to start with, I wonder if I can get your thoughts on Lee Anderson's remarks and also his continued refusal to apologise for them this week.
Well, I think that Lee Anderson's comments were, in my view, I called it a form of anti-Muslim conspiratorial idiocy. I think that when you're talking about Muslim Mayor of London and suggesting that, or asserting that he's in the pockets of Islamists and he's given the city away to his mates, I think that's incredibly reckless. Now, some people suggested that he didn't really mean to be anti-Muslim. He also referred to Keir Starmer. But in terms of talking about giving the city away to his mates and ultimately being in the pockets of Islamists, I'd have to say, Cindy, if I was an Islamist in control of Sadiq Khan, I'd be asking for a refund. This is someone who indulges in various forms of LGBTQIA plus activism. He's also expressed his opposition to the anti-Israel BDS movement, boycotts, divestments and sanctions. So if he is in control of Islamists, I wouldn't say that he's doing a very good job.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of his supporters, some of Lee Anderson's supporters, that is, have said that, or, these are just comments that Suella Braverman has also made, that actually there is this general almost exemption given to people who are pro-Palestine. But I think the problem here is that Lee Anderson suggested that Sadiq Khan was somehow friendly with them, and possibly because he was Muslim rather than anything else. Rakib, has ignited this whole broader debate, reignited, I should say, this whole broader debate about Islamophobia, what it really means. Labour is accusing the Tories of being institutionally Islamophobic for not adopting this definition that other parties have adopted. But can you just update us? What is this definition? Where did it come from?
So this is a working definition which was produced by the APPG British Muslims, and is ultimately looking to provide a working definition for so-called Islamophobia. Now, Cindy, I have a bit of a problem with the term Islamophobia. I much prefer the term anti-Muslim prejudice, because I think that the term Islamophobia in itself, it leads to, in my view, an unhelpful conflation between very real forms of anti-Muslim prejudice, anti-Muslim hatred, but also anti-Muslim prejudice in spheres of British life, such as the labour market, private rented housing, conflates that with, in my view, perfectly legitimate criticisms of religious ideology. And I don't think there's any religious belief system which should be insulated from criticism in a mature liberal democracy. And I think that was one of my main issues with this working definition. Now, I think there's actually an opportunity here for the UK government to develop and establish a solid definition of anti-Muslim prejudice. Now, that could challenge and combat common generalizations, unhelpful anti-Muslim generalizations, such as holding British Muslims collectively responsible for the actions of Islamist terrorist organizations, theocratic regimes in the so-called Muslim world. But I also think there needs to be a definition that allows for intellectual openness. Now, what I mean by that is when we're looking at how people feel about the UK, how do they feel about other countries? Is their religious identity stronger than their British national identity? I think we should be entitled to explore those issues, especially from a social cohesion perspective. And I'd make this point, Cindy, that this Islamophobia definition that I do have an issue with, it was modelled on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, I do think it's intellectually inconsistent to be very critical of the Islamophobia definition, but be largely uncritical of that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I think there's areas within both of those definitions that could be tightened in the name of clarity.
Tell us more. What is the anti-Semitism definition, and why do you think that has its limits as well?
Indeed. So I think that when you're looking at the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I'll give you one example. It suggests that a form of anti-Semitism is claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, for me, I think that there's certain policies, especially when it comes to the introduction and establishment of settlements in the West Bank, and that includes the arming of those settlements by the Israeli government. In my view, it'd be very difficult to argue that's not a racist endeavor, especially if that leads to dispossession and the displacement of Palestinian people. Now, that's not denying the right of Israel to exist, but I think that we have to be very clear that there's certain areas of Israeli government policy where we should be free to criticize those policies without the risk of falling foul of what, in my view, is it's a poorly crafted provisions within the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Equally, there's provisions in the working definition of Islamophobia, where it suggests that accusing British citizens of being loyal to the Ummah or other Muslim majority nations, this is a form of anti-Muslim prejudice. Now, in my view, if you were to say that British Muslims as a collective are more loyal to the Ummah, the global Islamic community, yes, I would say that is an anti-Muslim generalization. But if you're saying that there's certain British citizens and indeed politicians who may be more interested in the politics of Muslim majority nations, they may be prioritizing the national interest of Muslim majority countries or a global Islamic community over British national interest. Now, I think you should be free to make those criticisms, of course, as long as you have the evidence to back it up.
And you've made the point as well that some British Muslims think that about other British Muslims too.
Absolutely. Now, I think that one of the main problems with me, in terms of both definitions, is this idea of there's a Jewish community in the UK, there's a Muslim community in the UK. And I think that overlooks a great deal of ideological diversity within both religious communities. British Muslims are not a monolithic, homogenous bloc by any stretch of the imagination. Now, there's been polling which shows that 2 in 5 British Muslim respondents felt that their co-religionists in the UK tended to be more loyal to Saudi Arabia, which contains the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, than to the UK. Now, are we seriously suggesting that those British Muslim respondents are guilty of Islamophobia? That'd be a very bizarre take in my view.
Yeah, so I understand where you're coming from, Rakib. You're saying that criticism of Israel, criticism of Islam, these kind of political structures or ideological structures shouldn't be taken to be discriminatory as long as you're not anti-Jewish people, anti-Muslim people. Absolutely. So what do you make of politicians who kind of muddy the waters then by, using this as a bit of a political football?
We've got a very serious problem in the UK with our model of community engagement. All too often, our British state model of community engagement, especially in relation to the British Muslim population, has been responsible for sidelining anti-Islamist British Muslims, moderate, in my view, sensible voices, and all too often it's offered vocal identitarian, assertive tribalists with the regular seat at the policy table. And to be honest, I think that's reflected in the list of community consultation participants in the APPG British Muslim report on this working definition of Islamophobia. So I think we need a more inclusive approach to community engagement, because at the moment, the current model tends to empower actors who, in my view, tend to prioritise tribal interests over the common good.
I also feel like the community discussion around multiculturalism in this country kind of overlooks the tensions that might exist between minorities as well. I mean, we're still a kind of white majority country where the white people still have the majority of the influence in conversations like these. And so all they see is basically white people versus minorities. But actually, between minorities, there are a lot of history, baggage, tensions that people don't feel like they're capable of talking about.
Indeed, what you've referred to there is a very simplistic view of how social relations work in modern Britain. In fact, some of the sharpest social and political tensions are between and within ethnic and religious minorities. It doesn't involve the largely irreligious, white and secularized white British mainstream at all. And I think that was one of the main issues with the working definition of Islamophobia. Framing British Muslims as some kind of singular community, what it does there is that, in a way, it portrays British Muslims as some sort of victimized monolithic bloc, but also serves to conceal very real forms of internal discrimination and prejudice. Could be potentially between denominations within the British Muslim population. So I think that any workable, solid definition of anti-Muslim prejudice has to acknowledge the fact that the term British Muslim community is deeply unhelpful and serves to mask very real forms of sectarianism within British Muslim communities.
Rakib Ehsan, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.